This story starts here in the small coastal town of Lincoln City, Oregon. This story would in fact haunt this town for many years to come. In October of 1984, one day before Halloween, the mortuary that sits not too far from here, right up 101, would forever shock this town. This is a news clipping from that date. Sitting here on the corner of Southwest 6th and Fleet, right off of 101, is a mortuary owned by this gentleman, Dale Omsberg. Investigators arrived to this property, and upon further inspection, noticed an odor coming from the building itself, stated here in '84 in a newspaper article, what we will get to here more later. As the investigators approached the property, one of the investigators stayed back as the other gentleman approached the front steps. He actually knocked on the door, and Omsberg answered. The investigator told him of the tip they received anonymously the night before and asked Omsberg if they could come in and just check out the property. Omsberg complied and let the gentleman in to the building. As the investigators began to search the property, they began to question Dale Omsberg more about his building and how long he had owned it and things of that nature. And they both said that Omsberg seemed slightly off-put by this situation and was quite bothered by the fact that these investigators were here. As the investigators began to inspect or search the property more, one of the investigators noticed that there was in fact a basement as well, and asked Omsberg if it would be okay if they could look around a bit longer, and he complied. So the investigators began to walk down a set of steps leading into the basement, and as they were making their way down the steps, Omsberg, getting more and more frustrated and upset by the fact that these guys were here, began to kind of break down and start to cry. As the investigators approached the garage, the odor from the garage was so foul, but nothing could prepare the investigators for what they would see next. The first investigator later on stating he walked into the garage and then noticing a bunch of old wooden boxes stacked like a quart of wood, quote unquote, that were full of decomposed bones and bodies. Some of the boxes being opened. To immediate attention, the investigator realized that the tips that they received were quite real, and at this point, Dale Omsberg was arrested and charged with theft and abuse of corpses. Now, what makes this story even crazier and more creepy is as investigators began to question Omsberg at the police station, he told them that the bodies that were placed in the boxes in the garage, and in fact there was 16 fully decomposed bodies placed in the garage, and Omsberg's statement was they were getting ready to be placed in the Pacific View Cemetery, which was just right down 101, not too far from the mortuary, but in fact there were more bodies placed amongst only 3 grave sites. So 31 bodies for only 3 grave plots, not to mention the 16 decomposed bodies that they would find in boxes in the basement. After Omsberg was arrested and investigators started to identify the bodies, they would ask Omsberg why he would do such horrendous crime. Omsberg would then tell investigators he felt sorry for the families of individuals that could not pay for a proper burial or cremation, and he said that he was helping these individuals of families that couldn't afford proper burial. And since the laws aren't the same as they were back in '84, unfortunately Omsberg was only charged with theft and was later released and disappeared. No one heard from him for years. In fact, I think it was known in the city that he had moved far away from the town due to everything that had happened and the grief and everything that had happened with the families of loved ones that had been lost. But what makes this story even more creepy is the fact that years later Omsberg and his now then wife would be involved in a domestic violence case where the police were actually called to the Omsberg's residence in now California with a domestic violence situation. The police realized that his wife was battered and were looking for Omsberg to arrest him for abuse, and upon further inspection found Omsberg later on with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The last person he would ever harm would be himself, till Omsberg died of suicide.